This edition of the Bio Report is brought to you by the California Technology Council, providing discounts on products and services essential to every startup. For more information, visit californiatechnology.org/member benefits. I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. Scrutiny of drug prices around the globe is expected to exert growing pressure on the biopharmaceutical sector. EvaluatePharma, in its recently issued World Preview 2017 Outlook to 2022, says that despite the consensus forecast for worldwide drug sales hitting more than $1 trillion in 2022, it does reflect a drop from the same period a year ago. We spoke to Antonio Iervolino, head of forecasting for EvaluatePharma, about the new report, the outlook for the sector, and the potential for a new patent cliff with the advent of biosimilars. This interview was recorded live at the Bio 2017 International Convention in San Diego, so you'll hear crowd noises in the background. Antonio, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Dan.
We're going to talk about EvaluatePharma's World Preview 2017 and Outlook 2022. Let's start with uncertainty. The industry is now bathing in it. Last year, that was kind of a theme with the elections and Brexit, questions about the future of drug pricing, weak economic growth. Uncertainty seems to have grown worse, and questions about healthcare reform, uncertainty on tax reform, and drug pricing threats continue. The outlook for the industry, though, remains positive. How concerned should people be about uncertainty today?
I mean, uncertainty will never fade away. And when it comes to pharmaceutical and biotech, always have a large component of uncertainty, which is primarily baked into the clinical risk of these new compounds. There are many therapy areas where still there are large unmet needs, and there is still a large component of risk in the development programs. I mean, Alzheimer's is a clear example. We see interesting products coming up, but we know there have been many failures. I mean, the last one was Solanesma from Eli Lilly. And then also there is the pricing risk. I mean, the scenario is quite uncertain in the market in that respect. We don't know how the US reform will pan out in the next few months. But what we've seen in our numbers is that brokers are more mindful of this risk. And that while the industry is still growing positively, as we foresee a 6.5% year-on-year growth, for the first time in 10 years, our focus has been revised downward.
You talked about the first downgrade in sales. How big a downgrade are you seeing, and is that tied to pricing concerns or other issues?
I think there are two main issues. One is pricing, and that is linked to the big question whether the system, how long the system will be affordable for. We see a lot of innovation, positive innovation in many therapy areas, but all these new therapies come with a very high price, and so the question is whether the U.S. market, the European markets, for how long they will be sustainable with the current structure. And the second component that's led, in our opinion, to the downward trend in our forecast is the impact of biosimilars. I think brokers more and more see the biosimilars market becoming a reality in the next 5 to 6 years, and so we've seen for the first time a significant cut in the expectations for some of the largest biologic products, such as Herceptin, Rituxan, or Humira.
I've always thought of countries outside the United States being ahead of the U.S. in terms of biosimilars. Do you see the U.S. catching up in that regard?
They are catching up. They're definitely catching up. We see payers are much more responsive to biosimilars. Obviously, the market is not as established as Europe, for example, but I think they're learning also from the European experience. And I think the major change is that some of the new biosimilar products will be promoted not by traditional generic players, but for large biotech companies, Amgen, Biogen, that makes actually a big difference in terms of credibility. Because one of the key challenges for biosimilars is actually the credibility behind that. And that hurdle, I think, has been overcome.
You talk about a positive outlook for growth. What do you see as the big drivers for growth here over the next 5 years?
Still innovation. For the first time in the last 4 to 5 years, we're seeing a lot of therapies targeting specific unmet needs in many areas. Oncology, immuno-oncology is a very clear example. But we see new therapies in multiple sclerosis. Previous was launched in the last 12 months. And we see also innovation in some of the historically more slow therapy areas, like in the cardiovascular space. There's like a new wave of innovation that Entresto, Praluent, Repatha. Despite the challenges they had from the market access side, there was still an important innovation in that space.
One of the drivers for growth that the report talks about is orphan drugs, which have been a bright spot. But even orphan drugs are now coming under scrutiny for pricing. Do you see them being at risk here at all in terms of pricing pressures, or is that something that is not going to be a dampening factor?
Well, it's going to change also because the definition of orphan drug is somehow changing. Most companies are targeting specific niche population because they know that that's what payers want. They want to prove clear clinical benefits in very well-defined populations. So many companies are pursuing this strategy. So we're seeing more orphan indications being pursued by pharmaceutical companies, so it will be unavoidable. The pricing will be more under scrutiny.
We've got the potential for healthcare reform right now. We've got reauthorization of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, where pricing issues may come in. There's also a lot of dysfunction in Washington. Are investors at all discounting the threat of pricing pressures because they just don't think Washington can actually get things done?
I think historically the pharmaceutical market, the healthcare system in general has been quite slow to change. So in that respect, probably there's been more, the estimates have been more conservative. But I would say that in the last 5 years we've seen dramatic changes in the pricing market access landscape, especially in the US. Pharmacy benefit managers are now like one of the biggest hurdles for products to actually penetrate the market. I mentioned earlier Praluent and Repatha, even Nucala recently in the asthma space. Those products were forecast initially to ramp up much more quickly in terms of sales, and actually the reality has been completely different.
You talk a little about the shift from volume to value. We've heard a lot about this. I'm just curious, in terms of it shaping business strategies, are you thinking that in terms of the types of drugs pharma's pursuing, or are you thinking in terms of actual deals that pharma's reaching with payers?
It's both. It definitely value plays a role in terms of clinical development progress. We're seeing, clinical development programs, targeting placebo comparator that are no longer the case. You need to prove your incremental benefits versus, active comparative drugs which are being utilized today in the pharmaceutical market. But also, pharmaceutical companies are trying to be more creative and innovative when it comes to pricing deals. More and more we're hearing, both for established brands and new brands, pharmaceutical companies pursuing what we call, cost sharing, value-based agreements, trying to basically have payers paying only if the drugs prove the outcomes. Just prove the incremental benefit demonstrated in the clinical trial.
How are you seeing these strategies pay out? Are there things that companies are actually doing that you can point to?
I think it's has to be tied to the clinical development program. So you need to make sure that your drug is specific, is very specific to certain patient populations. So there's increasing use of biomarker and increasing use of companion diagnostic. In that respect, you're trying to make sure that your product is very meaningful for a specific patient population. Then you can expand beyond that, but you want to make sure you nail that specific patient population approach.
Once again, we're talking about patent cliffs after a period where that was all the rage. How big a patent cliff is this industry facing, and will this drive M&A deals?
Well, in terms of patent cliffs, we tend to call it the second patent cliff era. There was the first wave with the small molecules that went off patent 5 to 10 years ago, and now we see all the big biologic products at risk. So some of them already lost patent protection, already been challenged by biosimilars, and we have some other big biologic sellers being challenged by biosimilars in the near future. And in terms of M&A deal, there is liquidity in the market, and we know the pharmaceutical companies need to diversify their portfolio strategy. So R&D, we still see R&D in-house investment, especially when it's very focused on specific therapy areas, being the main driver of innovation. But at the end of the day, you need to diversify your innovation strategy, make sure you can tap into different pools of innovation research.
Do you think this is going to depend on some kind of repatriation of tax dollars, which everyone's waiting for, or do you think we're going to see a burst in M&A activity before that?
Well, that might definitely drive a ramp up in terms of M&A activities. For me, the big question remains on the value these M&A deals can generate. Well, in the short term, I can see some values. But long term, historically we've seen bolt-on acquisition, the type of bolt-on acquisition companies like Bristol Myers Squibb pursued, being more valuable to the long-term portfolio strategy of the company instead of the big M&A move.
And if you were to look at M&A, there are a number of companies that seem to be in big need. Where would you think are the most likely acquirers?
We know historically, companies like Pfizer have been always big in M&A and been trying to expand quite aggressively through pursuing M&A strategy. I don't think companies will change dramatically the M&A strategy. Companies that were more focused on bolt-on acquisition will probably continue on that path, and companies more used to pursue the big M&A move will continue to pursue those.
Well, there was a big drop in approvals last year. I think people should be cautious about reading too much into drug approvals in any one given year. But I think one of the most eye-popping numbers in this whole report, which is filled with numbers, is that it took $4 billion to get a new molecular entity approved, which is an astounding number. Are we back at a point where we're also not only talking about patent cliffs, but the lack of R&D efficiency?
R&D productivity will always remain an issue. There are certain therapy areas where the attrition rate is still very high. I mentioned the example earlier in Alzheimer's. So that is a challenge. Productivity is a challenge, will remain a challenge. And what we're seeing is now to develop a drug. It's not just the first indication you're going to launch. In the past, you used to launch a big product and a big indication. That was pretty much it. Now, if you see companies like Merck with the Keytruda or BMS with Opdivo, you launch the first indication, then you have 15, 20 indications following that. Those requires big investments in terms of R&D and clinical development programs.
You also touch on some of the new technologies out there like artificial intelligence, but we've had a parade of technologies that were supposed to solve this problem with R&D and efficiency. Are we seeing anything that's meaningful out there that may actually move the needle?
I wouldn't say move the needle. We're seeing some efficiencies, especially in the early stage development process. So some companies might be able to speed up the identification of new targets, and there is some of the early stage investments. But then when it comes to the clinic, you still need to run a very thorough and complex clinical development program. If anything, actually the cost nowadays is going up because, as I mentioned earlier, placebo trials are no longer viable for payers, so you actually need to identify comparators.
Do you think this is going to continue to drive the push to externalize R&D at bigger pharmas?
It's all about risk sharing, right? So you need to diversify your investment, you need to diversify the risk in your portfolio. So there is a balance between the amount of research you can do internally, you can operationally manage internally, versus the one that you need external support for.
Antonio Iervolino, Head of Forecasting for EvaluatePharma. Antonio, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Dan, for having me.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.